Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA in Washington, D.C. This is our December 16th, 2021 legislative update, and it is halftime here in Washington. The 117th Congress is halfway done as we head into election year next year. And so we can start to think about legislative accomplishments and get a better sense of what can be done before the next election. Before we move on, however, remind all of you, if you have questions, comments, things you just want to bring up, feel free to put them in the chat function on your screen and we'll rotate back to them at the end of the presentation. This is turns out early December is a pretty big period in early American history. December 16th is the anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, either when some rabble-rousers boarded some British ships and destroyed a large amount of British property, or the early shots fired in what became the liberation of the American colonies, depending on one's perspective. Little side note on the Boston Tea Party, by the way. It occurred on actually 3 ships, one of which was the Beaver. And the Beaver, while it was a British ship, was actually manufactured in the colonies. It was actually manufactured just south of Boston in Marshfield, Massachusetts, on the South River. And so it was, well, technically a British ship, was really an American ship. Today is also the anniversary of the ratification of the Articles of Confederation, the colony's first attempt at forming a government. It was a miserable failure, but resulted, when the Second Continental Congress got organized a few years later, in the drafting of the American Constitution, which currently is the most successful government in the world, in the sense that it's the oldest, possible exception of Iceland. But the U.S. Constitution has endured more than most governments in world history and still appears quite strong. Also worth noting that yesterday, the 15th, was the 230th anniversary of the ratification of the Bill of Rights. Interesting contribution from the colonists, from the United States, to kind of global democracy, the idea of a formal document telling the government what it can't do. That was an innovation from the United States, which was our gift to the world. Moving on, Build Back Better things are happening, just in the last 10-15 minutes on this one. Build Back Better is the large reconciliation bill that we've been discussing all year. The original originally 5, then 3, then 1.5, then $1.7 trillion bill. Couple big developments on this. First of all, the Congressional Budget Office scored the bill. That is, they looked at the bill and determined how much it would cost. And what it determined was that Build Back Better would cost $5 trillion over 10 years, of which $3 trillion would be added to the deficit. Now, a little controversy about this. Democrats immediately pointed out that the bill that the Congressional Budget Office scored was not exactly the bill the Democrats were currently discussing. I mean, they keep changing it. There's negotiations. There are changes to the bill as the various pieces of the Democratic Party try to find common ground. And in fact, since they're changing it constantly, the bill that was scored was not actually the bill that they're currently discussing. Republicans countered by saying that they're close enough, that the numbers are approximately right, all of which probably doesn't matter. Senator Manchin has expressed concerns over the size of the bill, and other senators have said they don't want to make it smaller. Senator Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, responded by saying he would keep the Senate in through Christmas Day unless they voted on the bill. That threat appears to be empty, and it is starting to look like Build Back Better, is not dead, but is definitely on life support, and that it will not, in fact, come up for a vote in 2021. If it does come up for a vote in 2021, it would probably be defeated in the Senate. Once a bill is defeated, getting it going again is much more difficult. There are some procedural hurdles you have to jump over. And so Senator Schumer is not going to let that happen. Now, as we've talked about before, it is possible that this bill could come up next year. The staff will probably spend a good deal of time over the holidays trying to negotiate some common ground, but it's starting to look like Build Back Better is in real legislative trouble. By the way, one of the ways we know that Build Back Better is in trouble is that the Democrats have shifted messaging. Rather than talking about this particular bill, they've started talking about the voting rights bill. This is a bill they've been pitching all year. That bill cannot go through reconciliation, and so either they need 10 Republicans to support it, which they're not going to find, or they need to get rid of the filibuster, which a number of senators are not willing to do. In other words, the voting bill has no real viable way forward. The difference, however, is that Build Back Better is a Democratic bill, and it was always designed as a Democratic bill. And so if it fails, it will be difficult for the Democrats to blame the Republicans. The voting bill has very strong support in the Democratic Party, but because they can't get those 10 Republicans to support it, they can plausibly blame the Republicans when it fails. In other words, the shift in messaging is designed as a political maneuver to blunt the damage done by the failure of Build Back Better should it fail. And the fact that the Democrats are doing that does suggest that they're starting to get ready to throw in the towel. We'll see what happens over the holidays. Maybe they can pull a rabbit out of the hat and find some common ground, but it's starting to look like that may not happen. There are parts of this bill that IEEE-USA is very supportive of, on alternative energy, electric vehicles, immigration, especially workforce development. There were some very good provisions in there. We'll have to have conversations with folks after the holidays to see what can be salvaged. The FY 2022 budget is not done, but it's been punted until mid-February. They passed a relatively clean, there was just only one or two policy provisions in it, so a relatively clean continuing resolution until mid-February. We expect the budget to be finished probably the first week of February, last week of January, which is nice. We have, generally speaking, the bill is quite good, as we talked about. We have some concerns about the research budget in the Defense Department, but legislative leaders have not really been engaged on that conversation because they've been trying to get other things done. So we'll have to rotate back to this in early 2022. The NDAA, the must-pass bill of the year, has apparently passed. It has passed both the House and the Senate with broad bipartisan majorities. President Biden has not signed it into law yet. He will, though. It takes a couple days to create the ceremony for signing big bills like this. The president has to order a bunch of new pens so he can write each letter of his name in a different pen and then give the pens away. Apparently there's supply chain issues with presidential pens as well. So there's always a little bit of lag. But President Biden will sign it into law, and then it will be done. There's a bunch of things in the bill that we like. It is a relatively narrow NDAA in the sense that most provisions do in fact deal with the Defense Department. There aren't a lot of the extraneous provisions that were added last year, but there are a few. Excuse me. Among the provisions we like, several of them are up there. Strengthening DoD cybersecurity and explicitly using a zero trust model of cybersecurity. That's the approach to cybersecurity that the IEEE-USA Communication Policy Committee, Committee on Communication Policy, is looking at. It fully funds the U.S. Cyber Command, requires the DHS to develop plans to improve cybersecurity across the entire government, not just the DoD. Money for research, which is good. Establishes a national microelectronics research network. Now, that is explicitly part of the CHIPS Act. It actually says that in the bill. It's not the important part of the CHIPS Act, but it is part of it, and it is a good part of it that we support. The CHIPS Act will be one of those provisions that we work hard next year to resurrect now that it has dropped out of the other bills. Working hopefully with Senator Schumer on that. The NDAA also instructs the DoD to address unidentified aerial phenomena. Those would be UFOs. Not entirely sure what they're going to do about UFOs, but it's interesting that it's in there. In addition to all of that, there were 3 smaller bills on dealing with artificial intelligence that were added to the NDAA. all of which IEEE-USA supported and promoted in Congress this year. So we're excited about this. The AI for the Military Act helps provide training to DoD employees on AI technology, helps them use it, helps them development, helps them implement AI systems. The AI Transparency and Capability Act, implements recommendations from the National Security Council's AI Committee, or AI report. Among many other things, involves talent recruitment, making it easier for the federal government to hire AI experts, and improves the transparency and accountability of government-run AI systems. And the Advancing American AI Innovation Act creates a data library of federal DoD AI systems that should help move AI technology out of the Defense Department into broader society, helping with that tech transfer process. Also should make it easier for small and mid-sized tech companies to bid on DoD AI projects. We have to specifically thank Senators Portman, Heinrich, and Rosen for their work on this. Good, solid, bipartisan coalition of senators that have been supporting these bills and were instrumental in getting them added to the NDAA, and we are grateful for all three of their efforts. The debt ceiling has also passed, which is good because it needed to be passed yesterday, so it made it through in time. But it's interesting to note how the Senate did this. The Senate took 2 votes. The first vote was to create a narrow one-time exception to the filibuster rules. So that required some Republicans to vote for it, which they did, but it then allowed the debt ceiling increase to pass without any Republican support, which it did. In other words, by creating this one-time exemption to the filibuster rule, it allowed Republicans to vote no on the debt ceiling increase while still allowing the debt ceiling increase to pass. Most legislators know that they had to do this, but they also knew that it was unpopular for them to do this. This allowed the Republicans to say no while still allowing the bill to pass, which is important. The Democrats, for their part, got what they wanted out of this vote as well, in that the debt ceiling was raised much more than they were originally talking. They were originally talking about $430 billion. Instead, they raised it by $2.5 trillion. The significance of that is that it makes sure the debt ceiling will not be reached until after next year's election, so they don't have to do this again. And so Democrats got the issue off the table for an election year. Republicans got to be able to say they voted no on it. So everybody got what they wanted. Most importantly, the American public and American economy got the debt ceiling raised, which is kind of a big deal. On some other issues, we have an interesting opportunity next year in Texas. Texas has an interesting little provision in their state government, which requires the legislature to review every government program every 3 years. So after 3 years after a program is created, it is sunsetted unless the legislator acts to keep it around. Their sunsetting commission is actually, I think, a pretty innovative approach to government oversight. IEEE-USA's own Erica Wasalik, one of my colleagues, served as a staff member of the Texas Sunset Commission before coming to IEEE, so this is something we know quite a bit about. Coincidentally, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT, is up for review in 2022. ERCOT is a nonprofit, semi-quasi-government agency which oversees the Texas electrical grid. You may recall that last winter, the Texas electrical grid had a problem in that it basically shut down for several days, depriving large number of Texans of electricity for an extended period of time in the dead of winter, which was very bad. And in fact, a large number of people died as a result. So the Texas legislature is going to take this review of ERCOT as an opportunity to review the management of the entire Texas electrical grid, which will give us an opportunity to talk about what we think should be built into a grid to ensure that it is reliable and efficient. The IEEE-USA Energy Policy Committee has a number of documents on grid management, which we will be bringing to the attention of the Texas legislature. By the way, I should pause for a moment and note there's a reason why Texas is doing this a year after the grid collapsed, and that is that the Texas legislature is only in session every other year, and 2021 was not the year. 2022 is. And so this is actually the first opportunity the legislature has to look at the grid, and they've signaled that they're going to be making it a priority, which is exciting. Coincidentally, the 2022 IEEE-USA Vice President for Government Relations, Becky Taylor, and the chair of our Energy Policy Committee, Tom Pierpoint, are both Texans. Will Robinson, who has been our Vice President of Government Relations for the last 2 years, is also in Texas. Turns out there are a lot of high-quality IEEE volunteers from Texas, but that should position us nicely to play a role in this review and to help the legislature understand how their grid really ought to be managed. So we're looking forward to that project. There's a link there on the screen to the Texas Sunset Commission. Texas does a really good job of putting a lot of their internal documents online, their internal review documents. And there's already a good number of documents up there on the electrical grid and on ERCOT if you are curious. A little note on blockchain, something that I think is going to be getting higher priority in Congress next year. This is blockchain and cryptocurrencies, bitcoins and all that together. The Blockchain Association, which is an association of industry companies, businesses that are involved in blockchain and Bitcoin and all that. Their membership has doubled over the last year in direct result of the provision that was added to the infrastructure bill that has become law and will make it much harder to deal in Bitcoins and other cryptocurrencies moving forward. When associations like the Blockchain Association suddenly get much bigger, they usually get much more active and become much louder in Washington, which does suggest that this issue will get it higher priority and have a higher profile in the DC press. 2022 isn't going to be a great year for a major new initiative, and I don't think Congress is quite ready for that. Frankly, they haven't really gotten their head around the whole cryptocurrency blockchain thing. They're starting to, but it's still a little bit out of reach of them. But 2022 will be a good year to educate staff. Because it is an election year, the actual legislators will be spending as much time in the home district as they possibly can, but their staffs won't. And that will give us opportunities to have longer than usual conversations with staff about the technology, what it is, what it can do, and what it can't do to help them wrap their heads around this as they get ready for kind of maybe a bigger effort to regulate all of this in 2023. Interesting little article in Politico a couple days ago. Politico, for those of you who don't know, is one of the DC newspapers that covers Capitol Hill, along with Roll Call and The Hill. My personal preference is The Hill, but they all do their own thing. So if those of you who really want to know what's going on in Washington, go to their sites and read what they have. But they had this article, which they contacted a large number of cybersecurity experts in and around Washington, within the agencies and private industry, in some of the think tanks and kind of advisory groups around Washington, as well as policymakers in Congress and the administration themselves, and said, what should Congress be focusing on in 2022 in cybersecurity? And interestingly, a couple of the issues that they highlighted are things that we already are highlighting, which does suggest we'll have opportunities on these matters next year. The number one most cited issue that policymakers and policy folks think needs to be addressed is the incident reporting plan. You may recall part of the cybersecurity debate is what happens when a company is attacked? Who do they have to tell? At the moment, they don't have to tell anybody. But there's broad agreement across the private sector and government that companies should really be telling the government when they are attacked, what happened, what did they do, what worked, what didn't work. The problem is nobody can agree on what exactly those reports look like. And we've talked about this before. How much information do companies have to give to the government? Who in the government can see that information? And most importantly, can companies be sued based on that information? And so nobody's disputing the need for this reporting plan. The debate is really what the plan would exactly entail. Companies, the government, policymakers all agree this needs to be a priority, although there is nothing near consensus as to what the answer actually is. Lots of people also understand the need for workforce development. IEEE-USA was ahead of the curve on that one. The United States needs more PhD cybersecurity experts to build our state-of-the-art defenses, maybe some other things. But we also need kind of people with more basic education in how to install, maintain, manage cybersecurity systems for small businesses, mid-sized businesses, local governments, local utilities. It's all well and good for the Department of Defense to have cybersecurity experts, which they need, but lots of other pieces of the government and of society need cyber experts, and we just simply don't have enough of them. And so the government will need to invest in developing that workforce. And then people talked about general capacity building. Congress has done a good job over the last couple of years creating institutions, organizations, bureaus, departments, whatever, within the U.S. government to build cyber defenses, to coordinate cyber defenses across agencies. Now they have to put those systems to work. They have to staff up. They have to develop the procedures, the processes, the regulations they need to operate, and then get to it and get to work. And so that, according to a lot of experts, needs to be a priority in 2022, all of which is consistent with IEEE-USA policy, and all of which is things that we can engage on next year. For those of you who are into these sorts of things, there are some very good sites out there with information on state redistricting efforts. As you all know, every 10 years, states have to redraw all their political boundaries to adjust to population shifts. 538.com it has some really good analysis of what the various states are doing and the implications of what they're doing. The Brennan Center, kind of to my surprise, has some really good, basically all they have are links to state sites. But if you don't want to look at somebody's analysis of what the maps are looking like in your state, they have links to your actual government plan. I did want to highlight what just happened in Virginia because something interesting happened. Virginia has a nonpartisan, or actually a bipartisan, redistricting committee, which was designed to cut back on gerrymandering. It's a fairly big committee made up of an equal number of Republicans and Democrats, and they were tasked with coming up with new district lines, and they failed. The two parties could not agree. But Virginia has a plan B. If the Redistricting Commission could not reach a decision, which it couldn't, and in fact most people figured it couldn't, it goes to the state Supreme Court. And the state Supreme Court then names two masters, legal term for just an expert, one Republican, one Democrat, to come up with one map. And they did. And just a couple weeks ago, they came up with the map that is on your screen. Those are the congressional districts for the state of Virginia. There are 11 of them if you look carefully. And what you will notice if you look at that map is that it is really boring. A lot of straight lines, a lot of lines that follow rivers, county districts. And if you look at the state house and state senate districts, they're the same way. In other words, the masters did exactly what they were told to do. They produced a logically, geographically coherent set of maps, which is causing enormous turmoil in Virginia because it's messing everybody's plan up, particularly on the state, the state house and state senate levels, where there are, of course, many more districts. They've basically erased the entire current political map in the state and redrawn it, which is kind of entertaining for those of us who are just watching politicians scramble to figure out what to make of it. But generally speaking, nonpartisan redistricting commissions don't work because they usually get captured by one of the parties. But in Virginia, at least this year, that didn't happen. And we have a nice, for the most part, non-gerrymandered map, which is kind of cool. Last week, or 2 weeks ago, I announced our conversation with Representative Obernolte. You will recall Congressman Obernolte from Eastern California is a former IEEE member. He owns a software company and is, in fact, himself a software programmer. He's written games for most of the big gaming companies, Nintendo and Microsoft and all the others. So that conversation did, in fact, take place on the 8th. It was a lot of fun. It was very interesting. The congressman was surprisingly frank with us. And if you would like to see a recording of that interview, there's a link up on the screen, or you could just go to our homepage and find it there. IEEE-USA has reached out to a number of additional state House offices, one Senate office. Senators are harder to get. But we are trying to build on this success by finding other legislators who will have conversation with engineers about engineering policy, and we hope to have a few more of these to bring to you early next year. I think we shouldn't conclude here today without noticing something. NASA launched a satellite a few months ago that was aimed at the sun. And the satellite, in fact, entered the outer layers of the sun earlier this week. Little pet peeve of mine, most of the press coverage of that event talked about how great this was for science. Got a lot of good data, we have a much better understanding of the sun, all of which is interesting. But it's worth noting that this was first and foremost an engineering triumph. The engineers at NASA, some of whom are IEEE members, built a machine that could be launched from Earth, travel roughly 92 million miles, survive several hours in 2 million degree heat, collect data, exit the sun, go into an orbit where it's still quite toasty, transmit the data to the sun, and then go back. And that is quite an incredible engineering feat, and we should recognize and acknowledge the amazing engineers at NASA for pulling it off. I think too often the American public they're starting to take these sort of things for granted. But building a satellite that can go into the sun is still pretty cool and really hard, and IEEE should acknowledge that. So well done, NASA engineers. Our next legislative update will be Tuesday, January 6th, 2022. I'm operating under the assumption here that none of you want to talk about politics 2 days before Christmas, and so we will take the next week off and resume early next year as we start to look into 2022. We do know there are some big issues on the table for next year. NASA needs to be reauthorized, as does the SBIR program, which we've already started working with legislators on. The NSF needs to be reauthorized. So there's some big projects that need to be done next year, which give us opportunities to really engage Congress, in technology policy and really shape how these agencies and programs operate over the next several years. So I look forward to our conversation on January 6th. Please enter any questions into the comment section, and we'll rotate to that in just a moment. And while you're doing that, I'll remind you I'm Russ Harrison, the Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA in Washington, D.C. My phone number is 202-530-8326, and my email address is r.t.harrison@ieee.org. Feel free to reach out anytime if you have questions about public policy, what we're up to in Washington, your local state capital, things that we ought to be up to in Washington or your state capital, or just questions about IEEE in general. I'm more than happy to help. And with that, I'm going to flip back to here. Let me stop sharing my screen. Boop, there we go. Brendan asks, is it the case that NDAA appropriates no money? And that is correct. That is not an appropriations bill. It is an authorization bill, which is why I didn't get too excited about the DARPA funding levels, because the appropriators will deal with that in the appropriation process early next year. And Brendan is correct. Brendan Godfrey, Vice President of Government Relations, Communications, and starting next year, Career and Member Development. So he is a longtime board member of IEEE-USA, and he is also a Texan. And he did correctly point out that its commissions and committees can meet at any time. And so they will be working on looking at ERCOT next year, as we talked about, which should give us a nice, because Texas, while it's only one of 50 states, is of course a very big state, and I think the national media will be paying attention to what they do. And so that opportunity should give us a chance to influence how electrical grids are run and how policymakers view electric grids all over the country and not just Texas. And that is all I see on the screen. So if you have anything else, feel free to reach out at any time. I'm happy to respond to questions, any outside of the context of these updates. And with that, I want to wish everyone a happy holidays. Hope everyone has a restful and peaceful end to 2021. And I think I agree with everyone that we all hope 2022 is a little less interesting, as perhaps life can start returning to normal. Thank you all for joining us all year long. Thank you all for your support of IEEE and IEEE-USA, and we look forward to working with you again next year. Thank you.
I had the coolest job that any electrical engineer could ever have on the ground crew for Solar Impulse 2, the first solar-powered airplane to fly around the world only using the power of the sun. IEEE-USA has given me a competitive edge because of their support system. It is so much easier doing something and being out of your comfort zone when you have someone there saying, "You got this." IEEE-USA is more than just a network. It's a family.